We don't have time for everyone tonight." These 6 words silenced the gilded ballroom faster than a director's final cut. Thomas Ward, 82 years old and practically invisible in his rented tuxedo, remained seated as younger men in designer suits strode confidently toward the stage. The host's words weren't directed at him specifically, but they might as well have been carved into his invitation. After 50 years of crafting stories that made others famous, he recognized dismissal when he heard it. In the far corner of the room, partially hidden by a decorative column, Johnny Depp lowered his champagne glass. The Horizon Awards celebrated Hollywood's elite in a private ceremony, more exclusive than any red carpet affair. Crystal chandeliers reflected off gold rim plates, while industry titans exchanged practiced smiles across tables worth more than most writers' annual salaries. Thomas sat at the outer edge, table 19, watching his life's work, the screenplay for Midnight Crossing, being honored as a landmark of cinematic storytelling 2 decades after the film's release. The host, Cameron Wells, entertainment mogul and gatekeeper of tonight's accolades, hadn't bothered learning the name of the man who'd written the words that made his career possible. "Let's welcome the visionaries behind Midnight Crossing," Wells announced, gesturing expansively toward the director and producers already rising from their VIP tables. Thomas remained seated, hand trembling slightly around his water glass, the oversight too deliberate to be accidental. A murmur rippled through the knowing few, those industry veterans who remembered when credits told the truth. Somewhere between the polite applause and practiced speeches, Thomas caught Johnny Depp's gaze across the room, silent, steady, and suddenly focused entirely on the unfolding injustice. Something in the air shifted, imperceptible but definitive, like the perfect plot twist no one sees coming. Thomas Ward watched as his life's work was celebrated without him. The massive screen behind the stage displayed iconic scenes from Midnight Crossing, each frame extracted from his imagination decades ago when he'd typed them on a Smith Corona in his garage apartment. The film had grossed over $1 billion worldwide, sparked 3 sequels, and entered the cultural lexicon with lines that people still quoted. Yet here he sat, at the outermost ring of tables, his name absent from the tribute video now playing. Visionary direction by Martin Holloway. The narrator's voice boomed through premium speakers. Groundbreaking cinematography by Edwin Chen. Thomas's fingers tightened around his napkin. Not a single mention of the screenplay that had started it all, the story that had come to him during those sleepless nights after his wife's passing, the characters he'd breathed life into when his own seemed meaningless. A server refilled his water glass with practiced invisibility, much like Thomas himself had become, a ghost at his own celebration. At 82, he'd outlived most of his contemporaries, those who might have spoken up. The new generation running Hollywood didn't know him. To them, he was just another old man in a rented tuxedo, an afterthought invitation that someone's assistant had probably handled. Thomas straightened his spine, dignity his only remaining possession in this room of wealth and selective memory. The revolutionary storytelling of Midnight Crossing redefined cinema, Cameron Wells continued from the podium, his voice carrying the practiced sincerity of someone who had never created anything but deals. Tonight, we honor those who brought this masterpiece to life. 4 men stood at the front table, preparing to ascend the stage: the director, the producer, the studio executive who'd greenlit the project, and the star who'd become a household name by speaking Thomas's words. None looked toward table 19. Around the room, the glitterati of Hollywood applauded on cue, champagne flutes glinting under the chandeliers. A young actress at the next table leaned toward her companion. Who wrote it again? Wasn't it Goldman or someone? She didn't bother lowering her voice, unaware that the actual author could hear her. "No idea," her friend replied, scrolling through her phone. "Probably one of those writer's room things." Thomas felt something cold crystallize in his chest. 50 years of crafting stories that moved millions reduced to one of those writer's room things. He'd won an Oscar for this screenplay, an Oscar now gathering dust in his small apartment in Burbank, alongside photos of a time when words still had authors and credit was given where due. Across the room, Johnny Depp set down his champagne glass and slowly rose from his chair. Cameron Wells raised his hands for silence as the four visionaries took the stage. These men transformed entertainment forever with Midnight Crossing. Their bold choices. "Excuse me." The voice from the side of the room wasn't loud, but it carried a distinct timbre that commanded attention, the unmistakable cadence of Johnny Depp. The room stilled, conversations suspended mid-sentence. Even Wells paused, unsure if he'd actually heard correctly. Johnny Depp wasn't scheduled to speak. He wasn't even part of the Midnight Crossing tribute. "I believe," Depp continued, stepping forward, his movements deliberate and unhurried, "that we're missing someone rather important to tonight's celebration." Thomas felt the weight of suddenly shifting gazes. Faces turned, searching for the source of the interruption, then tracking Depp's line of sight directly to Table 19. "I've had the privilege of reading many extraordinary screenplays throughout my career," Depp said, his voice carrying without effort as he moved between tables. "But Midnight Crossing was something else entirely. It was pure creation, a world built word by one man." Wells recovered, professional smile firmly in place. "Of course, many talented people contributed to—" "One writer," Depp interrupted, stopping beside Thomas's chair. "Thomas Ward. The man who actually wrote every word of the film we're supposedly celebrating tonight." The silence that followed seemed to stretch into infinity. Cameron Wells stood frozen at the podium, microphone still in hand, his practiced smile faltering at the edges. The four men on stage shifted uncomfortably, exchanging glances that betrayed their collective realization. They'd been caught in an act of erasure so commonplace in Hollywood that they hadn't even questioned it. Thomas Ward remained seated, his weathered hands clasped tightly on the white tablecloth. He hadn't expected this, hadn't expected anyone to notice, much less speak up. Certainly not Johnny Depp, whose successful career had spanned decades without their paths directly crossing. "Thomas Ward," Depp continued, his hand resting lightly on the back of Thomas's chair, "wrote not just the screenplay for Midnight Crossing, but created the entire universe the film inhabits. The characters that made you laugh, cry, and see yourselves, those came from this man's imagination." A few murmurs rippled through the audience. Phones emerged from sequined clutches and tailored pockets as attendees discreetly Googled Thomas Ward. The younger generation, producers and executives under 40, looked genuinely confused, as if confronted with archaeology rather than living history. "I think we all appreciate Mr. Depp's enthusiasm," Wells said, recovering his composure with the skill of someone who'd navigated industry awkwardness for decades. "And certainly the writing team contributed significantly." There was no team. Depp's voice remained calm, but carried an edge that sliced through the pretense. There was Thomas Ward, alone, creating what Variety called the most perfectly structured screenplay of modern cinema. His name is on the Oscar. His vision made everything else possible. The director on stage, Martin Holloway, cleared his throat. "We're celebrating the film as a whole tonight, and of course, the screenplay was an important component." "A component?" Depp raised an eyebrow. "Like the catering was a component? Or the film stock was a component? Is that how we frame the foundation upon which everything was built?" Cameron Wells glanced off stage, where his production assistant was frantically mouthing something and gesturing toward the teleprompter. The carefully choreographed evening was derailing in real time, broadcast live to the exclusive audience of industry insiders. This wasn't a public ceremony. There were no commercial breaks during which to recalibrate, no exterior cameras to cut away to. Perhaps, Wells suggested, his voice strained but professional, Mr. Ward would like to join our honorees on stage. The invitation came too late, its insincerity transparent. Thomas knew it, Depp knew it, and judging by the uncomfortable shifting in chairs throughout the ballroom, everyone else knew it too. "I don't think Mr. Ward needs to join them," Depp said. "I think they needed to acknowledge him from the beginning." He turned to Thomas, crouching slightly to meet his eyes. "Unless you'd like to speak? This is, after all, your night as much as anyone's." Thomas felt the weight of the room's attention, hundreds of eyes on him, some curious, some embarrassed, some calculating the optics of the situation. For decades he'd lived inside his head, crafting worlds and people that others brought to life on screen. Public speaking had never been his arena. "I wrote those words a long time ago," Thomas said, his voice softer than Depp's, but surprisingly steady. "I never expected to be remembered." "But you should be," Depp replied, loud enough for nearby tables to hear. "They're still quoting your lines, still making money from your imagination." Martin Holloway stepped forward on stage, microphone in hand. "We absolutely value our writers," he said, sweating visibly under the lights. Thomas was an integral part of the process. "You've never spoken to me," Thomas said, finding his voice growing stronger. "Not once in 20 years, not even tonight when you walked past my table." The revelation hung in the air, damning in its simplicity. Cameron Wells was losing control of his carefully orchestrated evening, and everyone in the ballroom could sense it. The tribute video continued, playing silently behind him, scenes from Midnight Crossing flickering across the massive screen, dialogue that Thomas had written, mouthing silently as the film's stars enacted his vision. "I think," Wells said, attempting to regain command of the situation, "we can all agree that filmmaking is collaborative, and every role deserves recognition." "Then why wasn't he mentioned?" Johnny Depp asked, straightening to his full height. "Not in your introduction, not in your video tribute, not even in the evening's program." He lifted the small booklet from Thomas's table, holding it up. "His name isn't here, not once." A woman at one of the front tables, Jessica Liang, head of a major studio, picked up her own program, flipping through it with a frown. Others followed suit, the rustling of pages creating a hushed soundtrack to the unfolding drama. "An unfortunate oversight," Wells said, sweat now visible on his forehead despite the ballroom's perfect temperature control. "Perhaps we should continue with the presentation and ensure Mr. Ward is properly acknowledged in—" "In what?" Depp asked. "The amended video you'll never show again? The revised program you'll never print? The apology that will happen after everyone's gone home?" He shook his head slowly. "I've been in this industry long enough to recognize a burial when I see one." Thomas finally stood, his movements deliberate, dignity evident in his straight posture despite his years. The tuxedo might have been rented, but the man inside it had earned his place in that room more honestly than most. "I'd like to say something," he said, his voice carrying surprisingly well for a man who'd spent his life behind typewriters and keyboards rather than in front of cameras. Johnny Depp nodded, stepping back respectfully. The room held its collective breath as Thomas Ward, the forgotten architect of Midnight Crossing, prepared to speak after decades of silence. Thomas Ward stood, a man who had spent his life giving voice to others, finally preparing to speak for himself. The rented tuxedo hung slightly loose on his frame, but he wore it with the dignity of someone who understood the power of appearances in this world of illusion and glamour. "I wrote Midnight Crossing after my wife died," he began, his voice gaining strength with each word. "I was 62 years old, considered past my prime in this town. Too old for new ideas, they said. Too out of touch." The ballroom remained utterly silent. Even the servers had stopped their silent choreography, frozen in place, as if the entire evening had been paused. "I wrote it in 8 weeks, every day, 16 hours a day, because the story wouldn't let me sleep. It wasn't work. It was the only thing keeping me alive. Thomas's gaze swept across the front tables, lingering briefly on Martin Holloway. When Martin first read it, he called it the best thing he'd ever seen. "This will change everything," he told me. "We'll make movie history together." Martin Holloway stared at his shoes, unable to meet Thomas's eyes or the increasingly accusatory glances from those around him. The film won 7 Oscars. My screenplay was one of them. Thomas gestured toward the silent tribute video still playing behind the stage. That final scene, the one everyone remembers, the one quoted in universities and referenced in other films, came to me at my wife's grave. Those weren't just lines. They were my heartbeat on paper. Johnny Depp remained beside Thomas, a silent sentinel ensuring the room would hear every word. The power dynamics had shifted entirely. The forgotten writer now commanded the attention of everyone present, including the industry titans who had built empires on the backs of people like him. And year by year, Thomas continued, my name faded from the story of the film. In interviews, the dialogue became collaborative. In retrospectives, the screenplay became developed rather than written. Thomas gestured toward the 4 men still standing awkwardly on stage. I don't begrudge you your success. The film needed your talents to become what it became. Martin's direction was masterful. Robert's production secured everything we needed. Edward's performance brought my protagonist to life. He paused, his expression softening momentarily. But the story was mine. The words were mine. And tonight you celebrate as if I never existed. Cameron Wells, still at the podium, attempted to regain control. Mr. Ward, we absolutely value the contribution of writers to— No, Thomas interrupted, his voice suddenly sharp. You value what writers create, but not the writers themselves. We're disposable once the words are on paper. Replaceable. Forgettable. Johnny Depp stepped forward. This isn't unique to Thomas, he said, addressing the room rather than just Wells. I've watched it happen consistently over my entire career. The writers who create the stories that make billions of dollars, that launch franchises and merchandising empires, that win awards and create cultural touchstones, they're systematically erased from their own creations. An uncomfortable ripple moved through the audience. Many shifted in their seats, avoiding eye contact with the servers, now moving again around the periphery of the room. Servers who might themselves be writers, waiting for their break while serving those who'd already made it. I've been fortunate, Depp continued. My face is on the screen. I can't be erased. But for every recognizable actor, there are dozens of invisible creators whose imagination made our careers possible. Thomas turned slightly toward Depp. I didn't write for recognition, he said, his voice softer now. I wrote because I had stories to tell. And they're still telling your stories, Depp replied, loud enough for everyone to hear. They're still making money from your imagination. They're still building their legacies on your foundation. A woman rose from one of the middle tables, Elena Rodriguez, an acclaimed director in her own right. I studied Midnight Crossing in film school, she said, her voice clear across the hushed room. We analyzed the screenplay for an entire semester. Thomas Ward's screenplay, not a committee's work, not a team's collaboration, the work of one brilliant writer who structured a narrative so perfect, it's literally taught as the gold standard. Another person stood, James Chen, head of a streaming platform. I keep a copy of that screenplay in my office, he admitted. I tell my development team that if they can find me something half that good, I'll double their salary. One by one, people throughout the ballroom began standing. Acknowledgments, confessions, and appreciation flowed from tables across the room. Thomas Ward stood speechless, witnessing decades of invisible influence suddenly made visible. Martin Holloway finally stepped forward to the edge of the stage. Thomas, he said, his microphone amplifying a voice heavy with regret, you're right. We let your contribution fade from the story Because it was easier to focus on the elements audiences could see, the direction, the performances, the visual effects. He paused, visibly struggling. But the truth is, none of us would be here without your words. I wouldn't have my career without your words. Johnny Depp turned to Thomas. That's the reality of what we do, he said quietly. The words come first. Everything else follows. Cameron Wells, recognizing the tide had irrevocably turned, stepped back from the podium. The teleprompter continued scrolling unread, its carefully crafted narrative abandoned. In its place, something more authentic was unfolding, a reckoning long overdue in an industry built on storytelling, but too often forgetful of its storytellers. Thomas Ward, 82 years old and suddenly visible again, stood in the center of a moment he'd never written, but which felt like the truest scene of his life. The tribute video that had been playing silently behind the stage finally ended, the screen fading to black, as if acknowledging that the real story was unfolding in front of it. Cameron Wells had relinquished the podium entirely, retreating to the side of the stage where he conferred urgently with his production team. Martin Holloway descended the steps from the stage, crossing the short distance to where Thomas stood. The director was in his 60s now, his hair silver and face lined, but still bearing the confidence of someone accustomed to commanding rooms rather than hiding in their corners. "Thomas," he said, extending his hand, "this is decades overdue." Thomas regarded the outstretched hand for a moment before accepting it, their handshake captured by dozens of phones, now recording openly throughout the ballroom. The mythology of Midnight Crossing was being rewritten in real time, its origin story corrected before an audience of those powerful enough to ensure the correction would stick. Johnny Depp stepped back, allowing the moment to belong fully to Thomas. Around the room, conversations had erupted, urgent whispers and not-so-discreet discussions about other unacknowledged creators, other buried contributions, other stories that perhaps needed correction before they solidified into accepted history. "Would you like to say a few words?" Martin asked Thomas, gesturing toward the stage, officially this time. Thomas ascended the steps to the stage with Martin beside him, his walk slow but purposeful. The audience applauded, tentatively at first, then with growing enthusiasm until it became a standing ovation. Not merely politeness or social obligation, but genuine recognition of a wrong being righted. At the podium, Thomas adjusted the microphone to his height. "I didn't come here tonight expecting to speak," he began. "I came because even after being forgotten, I wanted to see my story celebrated." He paused, looking out at the sea of faces now focused entirely on him. Creation is a strange business. You pour your soul into something, then watch it walk away from you, becoming something separate, belonging to everyone except its creator. Johnny Depp had returned to his seat, but his gaze remained fixed on the stage, his expression one of quiet satisfaction. "But perhaps that's as it should be," Thomas continued. "Stories need to outlive their creators. They need to find new interpretations, new meanings for new generations." Elena Rodriguez called out from her table, but not without acknowledging where they began. Murmurs of agreement swept through the room. On the periphery, junior writers and assistants exchanged glances, something like hope flickering across their expressions. Even in an industry infamous for its selective memory, truth could sometimes break through. "I won't be here for the 50th anniversary of Midnight Crossing," Thomas said, his voice steady. "But my words will be. That's the miracle of what we do. We create things that outlast us. Performances that move audiences long after the actors have taken their final bow. Images that resonate decades after the camera stopped rolling. And yes, stories that continue speaking long after the writers have fallen silent." He looked toward Johnny Depp, offering a small nod of gratitude. "We all serve the story in our own way, the writer by creating it, the director by shaping it, the actor by embodying it. No one does it alone, and no one should be erased from it. As Thomas finished speaking, the room erupted in applause once more. Cameron Wells, recognizing which way the wind was blowing, hurried back to the stage. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "let's properly celebrate the complete creative team behind Midnight Crossing, beginning with its creator and screenwriter, Thomas Ward." The evening continued, but something fundamental had shifted. In an industry built on illusion, a moment of rare authenticity had broken through. And in the days that followed, as videos from the private event inevitably leaked to social media and industry publications, the conversation expanded beyond one writer and one film to the larger question of who creates the stories that shape our culture, and who deserves to be remembered for them.